The land of my fathers, or more accurately, the land of my mother. What do you do about Wales? Like the Channel Islands, Scotland and Northern Ireland, Wales was a particular bugbear for the ITA when it came to giving them an independent television service. All the others were good solid English folk like them, but these guys had funny accents and customs and place names and even languages of their own. How are good London folk supposed to work with these alien creatures? It didn't help that the transmitter they were building in the Vale of Glamorgan was only 10 miles away from the coast, and so would end up covering the likes of Bristol, Dorset and Wiltshire, as well as the south coast of Wales, i.e. the more populous, less frightening bit, the bit that has Cardiff and Swansea and such like in it. Hence the first Welsh ITV service, going live in 1958, was a dual franchise, served on the English side from Bristol and on the Welsh side from Cardiff, or in practice, from London in both cases. Because why would you base a television company anywhere other than the very beating heart of the Commonwealth? It just stands to reason. That was Lord Derby's logic, and as far as he was concerned, it was airtight as a Lord of the Rings figurine display case in an obese bearded man's basement. His company was given the logical name of Television Wales and West, and was almost exclusively referred to as TWW. Lord Derby's would ultimately be the first face seen on the network. As it turned out, he was also among the last. This was all very well for Wales's first and second cities, but the North remembers. Windswept, proudly Cymraeg-speaking North Wales would have to wait a full World Cup before they got their ITV pictures. Actually, that's not quite accurate. The northeast of Wales and sundry parts of the coast picked up Granada and ABC's service for the north of England by default. But beyond that, between Wrexham and, say, Brecon, there was a big hole where ITV should have been. The Welsh being the Welsh, this was not acceptable, and eventually a consortium of Welsh businessmen badgered the ITA and the Postmaster General into creating a whole new franchise region to cover the rest of the nation, which necessitated the building of no fewer than 3 new transmitters. The company was called Wales Television Limited, although within minutes they were hastily renamed as Wales West and North Television Limited after TWW cried foul. Their station, however, would have the on-screen name of Teledu Cymru. Fortunately, Lord Derby couldn't speak Welsh. Teledu, and that is how it's pronounced because in Welsh U's sound like I's and Y's sound like U's, just to confuse you, went online in September 1962, and right from the off were operating under some pretty strict and arbitrary provisos drawn up by the Postmaster General, who seemed to have grave doubts about the necessity of any television service at all in Wales, or indeed anything in Wales or Wales. WWN were not to offer Welsh viewers a choice anyone else in the rest of the country didn't have. Their programming had to be at least 60% self-made, which was a real pain in the Philadelphia. They had to make by themselves at least 10 hours of programming every week in the Welsh language, on top of the Welsh language programming they were buying in from TWW and Granada. Every day at 7:30 p.m. they had to show a half-hour program that consisted of nothing but a still shot of the Prime Minister's face, accompanied by stirring music. The odds, in short, were firmly stacked against them from the start, and for no very good reason either. It didn't help that of the 3 new transmitters, only one was firing for much of the first year, and that was the one in the south. Their neighbouring ITV companies, ATV, ABC and TWW themselves, tried to help them out by offering up some of their programming gratis. But when Granada decided to close down their Welsh language operation, They essentially cut the main vein to WWN's heart. Bereft of their main programming stream, WWN collapsed after a mere 15 months on air. Officially the shortest-lived ITV station of all. Well, unless you count, we'll keep watching. It was probably inevitable that TWW would eventually buy out WWN. The ITA officially merged the franchises together, and now TWW was broadcasting to the whole of Wales. Unlike certain companies I could name, they weren't dicks about it. They gave WWN's shareholders a hefty kiss-off, they kept all their staff on, and they even kept the name Teledu Cymru, with the addition of their jingle and logo. I say logo, TWW had a cavalier attitude to branding, even by the standards of the 50s and 60s. They never really had a single unifying logo, and therefore no definitive ident either. As far as Lord Derby's team were concerned, as long as it displayed those 3 letters, it was good enough. This, with the rotating interlocking rectangles, was the closest thing they had to an actual logo, if only because it was the ident they used most often. For a while, all was well in Wales. The whole nation now had ITV, the coal mining industry was still going strong, they won 2 Five Nations championships in a row and drew a third, and no one had heard of A.A. Gill. When the 1968 franchise round came along, TWW were reasonably confident. They were successful, they were getting healthy ratings, and their original programming was quite widely acclaimed. They were even able to fulfill all those psychotic criteria that the Postmaster General had worked out that killed off WWN. So imagine their shock when the ITA announced that, in fact, their contract was not to be renewed after 1968, and someone else, someone flashier, someone more late 60s and less early 60s, would take over the job of providing Wales and the West with their ITV pictures. The ITA were under no obligation in those days to explain their actions, so they didn't. But unofficially, apart from the opposition having go faster stripes, the reason for TWW's abrupt and seemingly out-of-the-blue termination was believed to be the fact that, despite being television for the highly foreign country that was Wales, they were still headquartered in Utter London, rarely ventured into Wales itself, except for regional news purposes. Another theory, darkly muttered along the corridors of TWW, was that this was somehow an act of revenge on the part of Harold Wilson. The News of the World, then pre-Murdoch, had a significant interest in TWW and had recently published a string of articles critical of the Prime Minister. However, the ITA were a non-governmental body, answerable to the Prime Minister, but not required to do as he says. So it's probably not true, even if Wilson was certainly paranoid enough to have done something like this if he could. Although does it really qualify as paranoia when people genuinely are plotting against you? Whatever the case, TWW were understandably upset, and prefiguring the actions of Southern Television 12 years later, reacted to the news by throwing an almighty temper tantrum. The ITA offered panaceas and palliatives, such as offering to command the successor company to take on TWW's entire staff and studios. TWW weren't interested. The ITA next offered them a 40% stake in a new station, as long as they just stopped making a noise and let Daddy go to sleep. The baby spat it back at them, albeit on the advice of their bank rather than solely out of pique. Ultimately, as is ever the case when a resistible force meets an immovable object, the inevitable finally set in and the Paddy turned into a passive-aggressive sulk. Oh, you don't want us anymore? Fine, we'll leave. We'll leave right now if that's what you want. No, you said you didn't want us anymore. We're leaving. Goodbye forever. Or translated into practice, TWW voluntarily shut down 5 months before their contract was even up, and long before their successors were prepared, effectively cutting off their nose, lips and ears and shaving their eyebrows to spite their face. On the 4th of March 1968, the station defiantly closed down, with a 2-part send-off prefigured by Lord Derby furiously bellowing down the lens about how unfair it all was. The programmes themselves were a celebratory variety show called All Good Things, and the rather less good-natured Come to an End, which consisted of future poet laureate and friend of the station John Betjeman shuffling around an abandoned studio, reciting a poem and paying tribute to a station he affectionately called Tellywelly, for reasons beyond the realm of normal human understanding. "It's like the death of an old friend," he said, and then turned on his heels and left. As he did so, and the credits rolled, the camera panned to the exit sign above him. Fade to black. TWW just became the very first station in the country to close down without any formalities whatsoever. No national anthem of England or Wales, and no announcement. Television just stopped. And maybe it wouldn't come back, because TWW had just downed tools and quit early, effectively selling 5 months' worth of airspace to their successors. But they, of course, had been preparing to take over under the assumption that it would be in September, not March, and they were woefully underprepared. They'd been bequeathed 5 months of broadcasting time, but at this stage they didn't have the resources to broadcast 5 minutes. Faced with the prospect of blank screens across the Principality for almost half a year, the ITA put together a compromise. The programmes would be made by the remains of old sulky knickers, while the new company would get the advertising revenue, paying TWW a flat fee for the privilege. Since it wouldn't be politic to use either company's name on screen, the ITA went with the grimly functional Independent Television Service for Wales and the West, although the Teledu Cymru name was given a lap of honour in the Welsh sub-region. The ident was similarly functional. 4 horizontal stripes move aside to reveal the 4 lines of the name. No moving footage exists, but you get the idea. This interim service, which the local papers ended up dubbing ITSWW out of sheer desperation, puttled along for a good 12 weeks. Long enough for viewers to get over their initial abject bewilderment at the notion of change itself, not to mention the fact that their programme still said TWW production, despite the fact that TWW had made such a massive fuss about their own demise. By May, the new boys were ready to take over for good, still laudably early, and the rump TWW finally vanished forever. And if ITSWW had been confusing, the new station was positively alien.
This is Harlech, which provides your independent television programs, broadcasting on the transmitters of the Independent Television Authority.
Harlech had arrived. Contrary to what a lot of viewers assume, the name was not a reference to his defiantly Welsh roots. It was named after its founder and figurehead, David Ormsby Gore, Lord Harlech, seen here kissing up to a sheikh in his previous incarnation as a diplomat and Foreign Office mainstay. Ormsby Gore had recently retired from international diplomacy, having been shaken by the assassination of John F. Kennedy while he was the British ambassador to the US. Harlech Television was his new venture, and promised to be new, fresh, modern, exciting, wow, and all the other things that new ITV companies from TVS to TSW would claim to be. What was different was his insistence on how utterly Welsh it all was, despite the fact that had their patron been Lord Montague, it would have been called Montague Television. The name might have been a coincidence, but they were still packing some serious credentials, with backers including the great journalist Winford Vaughan Thomas, the great Zulu killer Stanley Baker, and the great Welshman Richard Burton. Harlech set out its new, modern, exciting, etc. stall immediately with that eye-raping op-art meets pop-art ident. One of the most unusual and probably the most eye-unfriendly ident ever seen on British television. It was also one of the first to have a nighttime variant, which was created by the highly scientific process of flipping the regular version into negative. To be fair to Harlech, this ident was made for old televisions that could only display a picture made of 405 lines, on which it looked somewhat less like a psychedelic brainwashing tape. These days, with our CGI and our HD and 3D and hula hoops and listening to the Beck, we're relatively spoiled for lush effects, to the extent that all our idents these days are live-action tableau and highfalutin dioramas. Simple graphics can't compete anymore. Back then, however, technology was still at a point where a judicious use of spirograph and lined paper could provide something unseen on British screens up to that point. And under 405 lines there would have been less of the whole moire thing going on. Yet another reason why living in the future sucks. In the event, both the ident and the name lasted just a couple of years, because colour was right around the corner. How this thing would have been translated into RGB is anyone's guess, because Harlech didn't bother. Instead, they came up with a new logo and an abbreviated name, the overt Welshness of the name Harlech reportedly having alienated the viewers on the other side of the Bristol Channel, who didn't live particularly near the Welsh and furthermore didn't care about what they did. Hence, HTV. Same bubbling Moog jingle, the same subliminal reinforcement of the name Harlech at the end, but much easier to look at and sporting a newly abbreviated name and logo, known as the Arial, because, hey. One thing about logos like this, where the letters are merged and squished together, is that at some stage they technically cease to be letters at all, just coincidental arrangements of lines. If you repeat a word over and over again, it eventually loses its meaning and becomes a series of noises. It's called semantic satiation. Logos like this one tend to be subject to the visual equivalent. If you stare at it too long, or if you see it every day on your television screens, it eventually ceases to look like anything at all in particular and just becomes a sort of sigil, representing to your subconscious that channel that Coronation Street is on, but with no inherent meaning left to it whatsoever. That's why it didn't matter that TSW's logo didn't look like anything. After a while it just looked like TSW. Mind you, that kind of visual satiation will happen to anything if you stare at it for long enough. Moral of the story is, don't stare at anything for that long. Rather than pad out the show with all the Cymru Wales/Wales/West variants, I'll just point out that the West version of the ident was identical, except instead of Cymru Wales at the bottom, it said West at the top, and that later versions would drop the Cymru and move the word Wales to where the word West is, and aren't you glad I'm not padding the show out with all this? The presence of Cymru in the first decade of the Ariel symbolised the fact that they showed Welsh language television, this being the officially designated Welsh TV station, alongside BBC Cymru Wales, of course. And in a move absolutely anyone could have foreseen, the attempt to placate the west side of the region just alienated the Welsh instead. And it didn't help that using the word Cymru occasionally represented the high point, if not the entirety, of HTV's self-made Welsh language output. Caught between two stools, they found themselves unable to please either. It's worth pointing out at this point for the benefit of foreign viewers that while the Welsh language might just sound like English spoken backwards with chronic catarrh, it is pretty much the second most important thing in Wales after rugby. For many it's a first language, such as Hugh Edwards, Alex Jones,
Yn ddigwyddiad llawn hwyl yn lliwgar iawn gyda digon o bethau I bawb I
or
wneud.
the legendary John Cale, the greatest living Welshman after the death of Philip Maddock, another native Welsh speaker. In certain secluded parts of the north, if you're heard to mutter a syllable of English, they set you on fire. The Welsh language was and is a big deal, and HTV, it was decided, weren't pulling their weight. Simultaneously, the process had begun to inaugurate a fourth channel under the IBA's auspices, and the Welsh seized upon this. In the 1979 election, both the Tories and the clearly doomed Labour government included a Welsh Channel 4 in their manifestos. The Tories inevitably won, and perhaps equally inevitably, Welshed, no pun intended, on their promise. Shortly after being elected, the new and explicitly totalitarian Home Secretary, Willie Whitelaw, decided against letting the Welsh have their own channel after all. As a semi-Scotsman, maybe Whitelaw should have appreciated the Celtic spirit a little more, because that decision went down about as well as could be expected, i.e. like a concrete airship. Wales was in a certain amount of uproar. Some refused to pay their TV licences, which would have been counterproductive as that would only affect the BBC, the company making most of the then extant Welsh language TV in the first place. Others physically attacked the transmitters. Gwynfor Evans, the legendary leader of Plaid Cymru, eventually forced himself to the front by going on hunger strike, effectively forcing the Thatcher government into the first of many, or zero, depending on who you ask, U-turns. And so, ultimately going live the day before Channel 4 in England and Scotland, was born S4C, Channel Pedwar Cymru, or S4C, Channel 4 Wales for the rest of us. I won't be going into detail on the history of S4C because it's Channel 4, not ITV, even if it was still under the auspices of the IBA. Although I would like to call attention to the slightly overcomplicated branding they started off with. Wales for Cymru, like some kind of desperately confused heart-shaped tattoo. Confused me no end when I saw it at the end of the likes of Super Ted or Fireman Sam, kids animation being one of their main exports. But I couldn't leave S4C out altogether, particularly its birth, because of the definite impact it had on HTV. As of November 1982, they were no longer the officially designated Welsh television station. All their gawk-placating responsibilities had been lifted from their shoulders and deposited atop S4C. As all Welsh language programming in the country, from Poblycwm down to the Newyddion, decamped to the new service. With the bilingual burden lifted, HTV proceeded to scrub away all traces of the Cymraeg from the face of their station, including the ident. Other than removing the Cymru, that ident was unchanged for 15 years. Long enough to start to seem over-familiar, not to mention old-fashioned. Time to take the cue from the English fourth channel instead of the Welsh one. The new ident was very Channel 4 and very American. The logo was the same, but now rendered as a sleek CGI study in perspex, tinted blue on a blue background and flying in pieces out of an equally blue backdrop, representing nothing in particular. It's an ident, you're not meant to be thinking about it that hard. And all to a futuristic, if somewhat cold, plinky-plonky synth arrangement. As before, the idents were identical on both sides of the Bristol Channel, save for the letters after W. And of course, alongside these were the usual faces of image and continuity. As Harlech, in their first couple of years, they forswore such a thing in the name of progress and being fresh and new and with it and wow it, etc. But their hearts were never really in it, and as soon as they went colour and became HTV, InVision was back. Pre-S4C they would quite often, and rather disconcertingly, switch between languages, sometimes multiple times and
Before we join
occasionally
ITN
in
for an extended
mid-sentence.
news bulletin, may I draw your attention to a few programme time changes a little later on this evening. Am 11:15, cyfathre bwyr gyda Gwyn Erfil yn siarad a Jenny Eirian, golygydd y Faner. Then at 11:15, Jonathan Dimbleby.
Some of the more notable faces of HTV included Margaret Pritchard, who got more glam as the 80s went on. She also seemed to struggle between her native Welsh accent and the RP BBC English she was presumably trained in at announcer's school.
5 o'clock with Benny Hill. Now back to this evening, and in half an hour, Joe Jones Limited comes to a standstill.
The Welsh accent won.
Time when we join Richard and Judy at the dock, but first to Southampton.
Then there was the excitable and childlike, not to mention aptly named, Dylan Young Jones, Jones the Beard. He grew it so you wouldn't be able to tell he was 14. Some of them could be seen on both incarnations of HTV, but generally only as cover. Separate but equal, the west of England was served by the likes of the legendary Peter Marshall, moonlighting from Thames, HTV's Dr. Sex, Peter Crawford, and the tragic Annie St. John, so popular that when she left for Tyne's in 1981, viewers and the local press launched a Save Our Annie campaign to bring her back from those northern barbarians. And it worked. She returned in 1987 and remained until 1990, when she seemingly inexplicably committed suicide at the age of 36. The blocks were introduced in 1987 and therefore had a relatively short shelf life, because when the generic look came along in 1989, HTV offered very little resistance. At least the aerial worked better in the triangular aperture than some others I could name. They also took the opportunity to restore the word Cymru for the final time, just for the sheer hell of it. They kept this thing for several years, although eventually they got bored and put their logo front and centre instead of ITV's. They eventually decided to ditch it altogether in 1993, and following it into the bin was the aerial, after almost a quarter-century's faithful service. Replacing it, an arrangement of Dairy Lee cheese slices. The new ident was not entirely dissimilar to the old block slug from 5 years earlier. Simpler, no poncing about with a haunted mirror and revolving camera work, and even more ghostly, blue on blue with extra blue. Gone for good was the distinction between Wales and West. Both sub-regions now had the same ident. There was one problem: the music. I'm not saying it's unpleasant to listen to, far from it. I'm saying it doesn't work. It's an ident jingle, it has a purpose to serve, and it doesn't. It's not an especially strong melody in the first place, but the arrangement is the real issue. The tune is buried under multiple layers of ambient pads. An ident jingle needs to have a beat, and preferably a strong crescendo, if you don't want to leave your announcer floundering. This sort of thing, sounding like the work of someone who'd heard of Brian Eno but missed the point completely, was arguably worse for a continuity announcer than silence, because picking out the cues was far too much down to chance. The viewers weren't fond either, but this was the 90s, who cared what they thought. The announcers had much more cachet, and it was their protests that led them to rearrange the tune a couple of months later. See what difference it makes to be able to hear the melody properly. 1993 was, of course, the official dawning of a new era for ITV as the changes mandated by the Broadcasting Act started to take effect. HTV had survived the franchise auction 2 years earlier by the skin of their teeth, their £20.5 million bid being just over £1 million more than their nearest rival. But that was still a pretty hefty annual stipend. And inevitably, just like most of the ITV franchisees, HTV slowly fell into debt as the costs of running a station mixed with the £20 million blood sacrifice added up. None of this necessarily showed on screen at first. In-vision continuity was scrapped, but that was just because it was unfashionable by now. Also unfashionable by the mid-90s was the kind of ethereal vagueness that the 1993 ident exemplified. And everyone was sick to death of the colour blue. So, after the requisite couple of years' service, they changed tack again, this time making sure they got the music right first time. And though there was much rejoicing, for this was much warmer than its icy, ambiguous predecessor, even if warm appears to have translated into weird pea-soupy shade of green. So now it's 1996, and financially speaking, HTV are visibly floundering. Rumours of new takeover bids emerged almost daily. Scottish want to buy them, Carlton want to buy them, no, UNM want to buy them, and UNM, which you'll recall was the company that owned Meridian, won out, taking a 20% interest in the company in October 1996. They said at the time they had no interest whatsoever in buying the whole thing. Chinny reckon. Inside 6 months they owned the company from soup to nuts. UNM weren't Carlton, however, and they did allow HTV to keep their own name. They even got another new ident, this summary thing.
Students have revenge in mind now on HTV and campus cops.
Floating logos and voids are fashionable again by 1997, you see. Slightly half-assed animation, mind. Even then, HTV couldn't seem to settle down, and this gold and blue number was introduced in 1999. It was looming, but friendly, powerful, and confident. I like it a lot. The only thing that sucked about it was its timing. You know, if this set of idents had been created just for the one station, I'd probably think they were okay. Although months of protracted bickering between the ITV and the graphic designers eventually blanded out the final product, the Hearts motif works reasonably well, and while David Dundas's music is inferior to his 1989 opus, it's still driving and effective, the pulsing rhythm tying in cleverly with the visuals, even if it does feel like a B in search of an A and a C, if you know what I mean. But if you're going to rebrand the entire network with your iron fist, you need more than okay. You need exceptional. And frankly, in this case, exceptional would have to mean an ident that somehow vomits banknotes out of the screen. By now, UNM had sold up and left the TV business after failing to merge with Carlton. Most of their television assets were sold to Granada, except HTV. Monopolies and mergers insisted they sell one of UNM's old properties for the laughable sake of fairness. So Carlton took over HTV instead. Unlike with West Country and Central, they couldn't prevent HTV's adoption of the generic look, but after just a year or so, they adapted it. Comme ça. That's a Carlton ident mixing to a Hearts-era generic ITV end plate with the HTV logo. Truly a triumph of absolute corporate nothingness. Literally the only creative thing about them is the heart becoming the V in HTV. By the aughties, all that was left of HTV was a dormant company and the word Wales underneath the word ITV1, which is still more than most of us got. They even had the same pre-recorded continuity announcers as everyone else. It's very much the equivalent of a supermarket own brand, although one doesn't buy Tesco value products because the crisp, clean, spare packaging appeals to us. The marketing people at ITV didn't seem to realise that. Wales, along with Scotland and Northern Ireland, though not the other two Celtic outposts of the British Isles, remains to this day one of the only regions left to have a truly local television station. In Wales' case, it's not even on ITV. But at least it's there. Au revoir.
A very good night to you all. Sleep tight. Nos da eich i gyd, cysgwch yn dawel.